Hello and welcome to ArtShow. I'm Craig Stover, and today I have with me Andrew Mowbray. Hey, Andrew, how are you today?
Great, great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I had so much fun going through your site and other places to find work of yours. So I'm excited to share this with our audience, and I've got some questions for you about this. So this I wanted to start with this because so you have this giant collection of sort of quilts and then quilt related imagery, I think that's sort of combined on there. What made you start doing these?
So these started a while ago and they were actually kind of a project in between projects, sort of like in their tradition of like samplers and quilting. It was just kind of keeping myself busy.
Okay.
Um, they're two-dimensional, but I like them because the construction involves sort of three-dimensional thought. And I was really inspired by construction people putting up Tyvek around homes and thinking about, the home both as like a vessel and a body, and the quilt wrapping a body and the Tyvek wrapping the home, but also in relationship to domestic spaces and
Uh,
gender and like kind of traditional roles that people have fallen into and subverting those a bit. So you have like, construction men on the outside of the house, and then the interior, which historically in some cases has been relegated to women. So kind of inverting those. And so when I started out, they were really kind of just these samplers. Some of them were geometric, and then some of them have always documented things that are going on in my own life.
so I noticed that, I chose this one. I love the pattern, the design of this. Um, and I want to ask you about that. But I noticed like this one is an actual quilt, whereas some of them don't appear to be.
Yeah, so originally when I thought of them as quilts or samplers, it was like I put the batting in there and actually quilt them, and
Uh,
the Tyvek home wrap material has zero give to it. So you have to be really precise with how you put it together because you're not going to stretch that out in any direction.
hmm,
And so eventually that became less important, but I also have displayed them recently where you can see the back of the quilt,
hmm,
which I feel like is really important because it shows the process and the kind of like architecture and the
hmm,
seams, how it all goes together.
Oh, I love the back of artworks. I always thought about doing a book of the back of paintings. I thought that would be really interesting. Uh, where do the majority of these designs come from? Are you lifting them from somewhere? Are you modifying, or are these just straight Andrew inventions?
Um, I would say sometimes the subject matter is influenced by certain things, but most of it is like I'm limited to what I can do with the designs because it's either the DuPont logo or the Tyvek home wrap logo that's pre-existing, and then I'm using that to create these sort of geometric patterns.
Oh,
So it's
interesting.
interesting because depending on the quilt, some people will be like, "Oh, that looks like Inuit imagery," or "That looks like Mayan imagery."
Hmm.
And it's really just a coincidence. It's more that I'm like visually thinking a lot of times like, oh, that looks good, or that works, or I haven't done this combination before.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that. I have a much better understanding of them now, and now it makes me want to go back and look because the wide variety of different forms and shapes that you've been able to accomplish out of just those is pretty staggering. And there's a lot of different patterning ideas that you've got. So if you're watching this, go to Andrew's website. I need you to see that stuff. Uh, so I want to move on. The next piece I wanted to ask you about is this one, and I know there's got to be a story behind this. What am I looking
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier with the quilts, like kind of questioning traditional sort of gender roles and paradigms of domestic spaces and things like that. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Charlotte Perkins Gilman story, The Yellow Wallpaper.
at?
It's a sort of early, I feel like it's a sort of iconic feminist story. It takes place in the Victorian era, and it's about this woman who's a writer, and it's somewhat autobiographical in kind of a fictional way, but she's having sort of issues with sort of emotional issues, and her husband thinks it's best if they go out to the country house and she stays up on the top floor and rests.
Mm.
And also, this is based on the advice of like another character in the story, which is this male doctor.
Mm.
So it turns out to be a frightening story. It's a short read. Everyone should read it.
Okay.
It's really amazing. And it deals with this yellow wallpaper. Uh,
Mm.
and the main character starts to think that she is seeing things in the wallpaper. So I was, it's always kind of like when I had read it and I was taught about it when I was younger, it was like, oh, the horrible men in the story. But it was interesting for me because I started thinking about like these men at the time were doing what they thought was best,
Mm.
but it was actually not
It's the
not good
exact
at all.
opposite.
Yeah,
Well, and
so I found this yellow wallpaper years and
okay.
years and years ago. I held on to it for 10 years and I'm like, I am going to use this in a piece at some point in time. Um, so it's kind of ornate and it's fragile. And so this is a suit that fits me. It's a 42 regular
You have
that
a
I made
photo
for
of you wearing it?
myself. Yeah, and it's one of these things. It's interesting because I felt like sort of like wearing it is like me kind of embracing the story or trying to understand.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's also really fragile. And then it's also like a patterned yellow suit, which I find like for certain men out there in the world, that can be a threatening thing. Like somebody that wears like a really sort of flamboyant suit.
When I first
Um,
saw it, my first thought was the Joseph Beuys felt suit. Right. So I
yes.
started thinking about that, the idea of this, using materials to change the subject matter of the suit itself. And then as you were talking about the story about the wallpaper, it made me start thinking about Gone with the Wind, where she made the dress out of the drapes, kind of a thing.
You know what? I hadn't thought of Gone with the Wind, but I'll tell you when I watch Sound of Music, it's like I'm like, oh my gosh, like freaking out about all the pattern in that movie and the curtains and so
There's a
yeah,
whole
and that's
show
an
there. Yeah.
interesting sort of like domestic space and relationship to sort of interrogate and question.
I,
Um
I, I love the suit. I'd like to, I hope you in the future can edition them. I'll pick one up. So, oops, we went a little too far there.
So in that suit was the name of the installation. It was at the time Gallery Diet, which is now
Mhm.
Nina Johnson Gallery, but it was part of an installation in a little room and it was called You Make Me Crazy, which I saw as both a term of endearment, but also just something
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
frustrating. Um
So the joy for me when I went to your website was to see the breadth of different materials, mediums, and thought processes that you have in your work. And so you did a series of these crates, and this one for me really stuck out. So this one's concrete, right? So what made you make a series of crates?
um I've been fascinated by crates. I like didn't realize it was a personal thing then until I recently realized like, oh yeah, I made ice cream growing up as like when I was in my teens and was like surrounded by milk crates. And then when I went off to school in Baltimore, I like packed up all my belongings in milk crates. And they've always just been this thing in my life. And they're like
Mm-hmm.
functional and they're architectural and they're amazing, but I love them because I live in the city in Boston and I just see them in places. And sometimes I know somebody's using it, maybe as
Mm-hmm.
a bench or for their belongings, or college students use them, and they just seem to like float through the world. So I became
Mm-hmm.
really fascinated with them as objects that can take on different things. And they're like a little quilt piece too. They can stack
Mm-hmm.
together and become something larger.
Oh yeah.
But they're also labeled so that they're owned by corporations. You're not technically
Yeah.
supposed to use them. So with that in mind, I decided I was going to make my own that are like modular or can fit
Mm-hmm.
together with other milk crates, but are unique in that way. So I just started like finding materials and whatever I could make into a milk crate, I'd make into a milk crate, and then using like basic things like cement to like cast my own
Mm-hmm.
forms of those. And with these cement ones, I thought of them a lot of term in terms of materials that you see in the urban environment, but also like this idea of it being like a placemaker or
Mm-hmm.
almost this sort of like mini monument. Like it
Mm-hmm.
represents like how milk crates can exist in the or function in the city. Like who uses them? What do they represent?
Right.
Do they represent somebody that's, without a home, or how do those function? And then I just did a deep dive and we could talk
You
about
you went down
milk.
that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
I
milk
really
crate
like
for
that.
hours,
You've
hours.
got cement ones, but you've got wood ones, and I think there's a plush one and a few others, and it just made me like I love to see them together. I'd love to see them in person. And as soon as you started talking about corporations own them, I was like, well, where's the Chanel logo on this? Is it around the back? Or, you know, what? I want to see more of these. I
Well, it's
really love.
actually, yeah, the structural pattern just varies, but it doesn't really, the only reason the pattern's different is so it's almost like if you picture like a tartan or some sort of like plaid, it's like the corporation knows like, oh, that's ours. That's our
Right.
pattern. And I
Right.
started collecting all the different patterns, and there's like thousands of them out there. And the color
Wow.
schemes, like here's one right here. Like this is probably from the 70s. It's got that
Fantastic.
brown color.
Oh, I smell a
Um,
book, you know, the milk crate book. I want to see all the different ones. I need a catalog kind of
yeah,
thing.
that's I started. Yeah, that's a whole other
The
project.
whole nother project. It's another video that we'll do. So, speaking of breadth of stuff, I was thrilled to see that you make these gourd sculptures, but you grow them, correct?
Yes.
And so, I mean, I could do a whole show just on these, but what made you start doing these? Was there something that you thought like, oh, I could just grow my own sculptures?
It was more so I work at a college. I work at Wellesley College,
Mm-hmm.
and I am the director of 3D arts, and I work a lot with the architecture students. So
Okay.
this was quite a few years ago that I started becoming more immersed with the architecture program and the students. And I started
Mm-hmm.
looking at my own work at the time and just thinking like, what is my work doing? How is it contributing to like these thoughts and ideas I'm having about architecture and sustainability? And it
Mm-hmm.
was heavily influenced by like what my students' interests were to their interest in sustainability and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. I know this is totally out there, but I had a cucumber that grew in my fence, and we had moved somewhere where I finally could start gardening again. And I found these birdhouse gourd seeds at Home Depot. Everybody's like, where do you get your seeds? I'm like, I go to Home Depot. They're not that fancy, but
Mm-hmm.
so I was like, oh, these won't rot and they can do that cool thing that cucumber was doing in the fence,
Mm-hmm.
but I can like, so I started experimenting with making forms. The
Mm-hmm.
plexiglass forms you see are all made from reclaimed museum
Right.
vitrine
Let's go back
pieces.
to that for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just plexiglass from museum cases that was getting thrown out, and I cut it into
Mm-hmm.
size and came up with a form that could vent enough so that they wouldn't rot, but um, was big enough to let them grow, but small enough um, to form them into this square. So I
So
was
my
thinking in
first,
terms of,
go ahead.
oh, I was thinking in terms of like, we manipulate materials and trees and wood and things like that usually after we cut them down. But what if we could like front end that and like manipulate them before they even grow? So
Mm-hmm.
those kind of thoughts to build these building blocks.
I'm kind of curious as a fellow artist is when you're doing something like this, when you conceive this idea, do you think about like the archival nature of these? Like, does that dawn on your mind, or is it if they disappear in 20 years, you're fine?
Um, First of all, I did a deep dive into the research of these, and they think they're the first grown plant because they're a vessel.
Okay.
And then they also are pretty resilient. They
Yeah.
think they actually floated across what is now the Atlantic Ocean from Africa at one point in time and were traded by people all the way as far up. They found seeds in
Hmm.
archaeological sites in Wisconsin that like matched the DNA of the ones from Africa. So they serve a purpose. They have a functionality. I like the idea that they can break down. Literally, I have ones that don't fit in the mold properly because I don't adjust them in time, and they're misfits.
Hmm.
It might seem harsh, but those go in my compost pile. Like they are an organic material that can break down.
You
So
don't have to do anything for these. Do you hollow them out,
I usually
or
scrape the here, hold on, I got one right over here.
do you shellac
I
them or anything? Or
scrape the skin off.
hmm.
This one could be scraped a little bit more, and then I
Okay.
put a little just beeswax on them to seal them.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but
The
they're
great. It's a great shape. I love the form. You know, when I first saw it, I was thinking banisters, like an architectural banister form. And then I had to do a double take to see actually what it was I was looking at. They're quite exquisite. So I wanted to end on this piece because again I saw this and I'm like, okay, there's something else happening here that I'm not aware of. Is this an offshoot of the quilt project or an offshoot of the milk crate or is it a kind of a combination of both? What is
This is like I can't believe you brought this up because this is like an existential crisis for me right now.
it? I'm good at that.
This is what happens when you stop referring to things by their name. So
Hmm.
instead of like thinking of architecture as architecture, gourds as gourds, or quilts as quilts instead of quilts as architecture,
Hmm.
this is what happens. And then you make something like this that I don't know what to call it right now. It
Okay.
feels 100% right, but I'm like, what is this?
Right.
Um, so they're kind of, it's like upholstery for milk crates that is also modular. It can be a quilt. I have a
Okay.
list in my sketchbook of just things that are like things that are horizontal and things that are vertical in sort of domestic settings. So you
So
have
like,
like cushions, you have tapestries, you have
yeah.
paintings, like all of these different things. So these, I want them to have the flexibility to be a tapestry if they need to be a tapestry, or be a
Uh-huh.
quilt if they need to be a quilt, or be a rug, um, or be, upholstery for a milk crate.
I was kind of thinking about it like a milk crate cozy, like, the same thing they do for teapots and stuff. So the real
Yeah,
reason
and
I brought this up is so you work in series, and so my first question is when you work in series, do they overlap or do you start one, end it, and then start up another one? Because that last piece looks like it's kind of a combination of several things.
yeah, and I think that's why like I've been struggling with how do I like what is this thing, because it was like I'm like, oh, this is the perfect merge. It's like these things that like they're literally printed with a milk crate. They're like work with the milk crates. They have textiles,
Uh-huh.
printing, modularity. They can like split up and be individuals. They can come together and like,
Yeah.
I think of things in terms of like the Occupy movements that had happened years ago. I like in the most basic sense, my work is about things that share like similar parameters or ideas that can work together to create something larger. Like if we
Hmm.
can all do that, or my little objects can do that, I think it's that's a good thing.
Do you think that piece might be the beginning of a new series then?
Yeah, or I the way I've envisioned it lately is it's large. It's like
Okay.
literally
Really?
comes down,
Okay.
hits the floor, turns into seating. Maybe there's offshoot pads. I don't know that people always, oh, breakout groups. Maybe there's like breakout groups of these. Maybe I don't know. Are they like pot holders? Like they, yeah.
When
So
you do a series, do you ever put a series to bed like, okay, this is the last one, I'm never going to do this again? Or do you always leave the door open to maybe revisit it years later?
yeah, I feel like everything's ongoing. I think that like for me, the idea that you would stop something is like that something's finished is totally crazy, because I
Hmm.
know in my life there's nothing's ever finished, and then there's things that like food that I eat that I just want to come back to and eat. Like I would never want to like give up on some food that I really
Hmm.
like.
I
And
like
if
that. That makes a perfect analogy.
yeah, and if I'm in the mood for it, I want to be able to like go back and try that again.
Right. Why would I make 100 hamburgers and then be like, no, I don't want them? No, I'll
Right,
eventually want more
you might
hamburgers.
come across a new ingredient like I don't know,
Right.
pickled okra or something like
That's
that that you're like,
fantastic.
oh, that'd be perfect on a burger. So you have to go back and
That's such
revisit.
a simple way of thinking about it, but it's so perfectly aligned. I love that. I want to ask you about a question I love to ask artists is that helps inform to me their work. I want to ask about your earliest memory of art. When you were a little kid, do you have a memory of your first exposure to something that just has always stuck with you or bowled you over or anything like that?
I think a lot of us, I did drawing because that's what's immediately available. So
Okay.
I remember doing a lot of drawings. I was making a lot of things that I don't think I considered art at the time that I would love to go back and do again.
What
So
were you drawing? Do you remember?
I
Like,
had
did
typical
you?
stuff like I drew the Beatles' Yellow Submarine album. I had a huge
Okay.
piece of paper and it was like, I'm gonna do this. And I think in some ways it was about like trying to hone your skills. Like even at a young age, you're like, oh, I'm gonna
Yeah.
get like George Harrison's hair just right. And like,
Right.
Um, so yeah, that kind of drawing. I made a lot of lists too, which I still feel like I'm making lists. Like I
Okay.
remember when my neighbor across the street, we made a whole coded language that we could like write notes in the secret code and like hand
Okay.
them off.
You didn't
But
put the list in a milk crate, did you?
no, I didn't, but
Okay.
it would have worked.
Right.
Tree houses. I built a lot of tree houses, grabbing like scrap out of dumpsters from construction sites, and
Okay. All right.
yeah,
Sometimes, an artist will tell me something like, oh, I got exposed to a Rothko and it blew me away. And it turns out that their work is like big color fields. It's like, oh, okay, well, that sort of makes sense. So,
I
uh,
would say Jacques Cousteau was a huge influence.
really, okay,
So I
I
like
love me a
teetered
Jacques
on
Cousteau.
that, and I think the experimentation, but also the visual aspects of all of his movies and books were like
Uh-huh.
hugely influential. And I know there's like Wes Anderson's Life Aquatic, but
Right.
even when I was in graduate school, I did a piece about Jacques Cousteau because it was just
Okay.
one of these things. I'm like, I have to do this.
Yeah, that was like PBS Sundays at 12 or something like that. I
Yeah.
remember watching a lot of Jacques Cousteau. It's not in the air anymore. Uh, I do want to ask you about at what point did you decide that you were going to become an artist? Did you kind of always know, or did you just slide into it?
I think I didn't slide into it. As I mentioned, the Jacques Cousteau, I was really going pretty hard on that oceanography, marine biology route to the point that I got certified in scuba diving when I was 12, and I'm like,
Mm,
this is kind of it. Um, but it was my high school art teacher who was amazing. I didn't have the best grades in high school, but art was just always there. I had like taken all the art courses to the point that they were just like, okay, just take that one over again.
hmm
And I had a high school art teacher that was absolutely amazing, Virginia Fryermuth,
mm.
and she stepped in and became my guidance counselor, helped me with my grad school applications, all of that. I didn't really know what I was doing. I'm like first gen, so it's like kind of figuring the whole college process
I
out.
totally get it.
But she
You know,
came in, was amazing mentor. A few years after that, she was actually nice National High School Teacher of the Year.
oh, okay. So
Um,
she was spot
yeah,
on, the perfect person that you needed at that time.
perfect person at the perfect time. I think that's why I went into education also. Just
Great, that's good
yeah.
to know. So I have an idea about, I want to know a little bit more about your working process. And one of the questions I'm kind of curious, because you do seem to have these your ideas are sort of grand, and then I see how you're executing them. Do you ever keep a sketchbook? Do you sketch out your ideas, or is it more like, no, I already know?
Oh my, no. I mean, you're saying this right now, and I'm like, I have a sketchbook right here. I have, I'm a huge sketchbook proponent. This is another one
Okay,
here.
all
But
right.
it's interesting that you mentioned that because my sketchbook, if you want to call it a practice, is maybe not like other people's, that it's project focused.
It's almost
So this,
indecipherable.
well, it's a lot of notes and receipts and things like
Yeah,
that. But
yeah.
this one started, I think, I don't know when, like 2005, 2010. But
Hmm.
I'm still working back into it because that project has come up again.
Okay. Would you
So
ever
it's
show your
anything. It's not,
sketchbooks?
I mean, I really like, they're just rudimentary
Yeah,
drawings.
yeah.
It's like a hard drive for my brain.
Okay, that's good.
So,
Quick patent pending on that one. I love that.
but like
So,
even draw, I mean, this is me figuring out like a project right there. Those are
okay.
not, they're
If
not,
you if you had an exhibit, would you ever show your sketchbooks in a show?
yeah. And I have in the past for projects because they become pretty elaborate. I mean, I have lists and
Okay, all right.
all kinds of stuff in here.
It's
Sometimes
typical of a
they,
lot of artists. They either don't keep it or it's almost undecipherable. Very few make perfect works of art in their sketchbooks, I find.
yeah, I recently had a project that came back out, and it was like, luckily I had this because it had all the measurements and information I needed in there. And it was like, the project was kind of like putting an old Lego set back together. So it was
Hmm.
great that I had the instructions.
So knowing some of your work, uh, this is a guess. Are you constantly looking at new materials?
It's
That's
weird
something that
because I feel
interests
when
you?
you say materials, it can be like visual material or it can
Anything. Are you a
be,
collector? Are you collecting
I am, and
materials and supplies?
I desperately try not to collect because yeah,
Overwhelming.
it can get out of control. My
Yeah.
big thing now is like, which doesn't happen that often, but I walk my dog and I collect crusty coins. So
Okay.
I'll find like a coin down at the park. It's nothing fancy. It could be from the 80s, but it gets a little patina on it. And I bring it home and throw it in my crusty coin bowl.
Okay. Is
That's
it
one of
is
the,
it just the satisfaction of putting it in the bowl, or do you think I'm going to use that later?
it's the satisfaction of finding treasure.
Okay.
Like I think finding that little thing is just like, there's a
Yeah.
story behind this. And
I'm totally with you. I go away on vacation. We have a beach place, and I love to search for sea glass, which is funny. Like I get that endorphin kick, but like when I'm home, like I see glass everywhere. Like I don't care about it. It has to be the certain kind of glass. Like I know what you mean. That's very satisfying.
but that and then there's visual things that I've become influenced right now. I was just compiling images that I took. I was just over in Venice and there was this one thing that I noticed that I just all of a sudden when I zoomed in on it. And I am not going to say what it is because it's kind of like precious right now.
Right.
I
Okay.
am I am making a large Tyvek quilt based on that imagery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to come see your studio sometime. I can imagine all the ideas. It would just take me a day to just see everything. Um, we unfortunately have time for just one more question. It always goes by quick when I'm having a good time. Question I ask a lot of artists: what does making art do for you?
Hmm. It's interesting because I think when I was younger, there was like I did a lot more elaborate projects and it was about the fabrication and proving to myself that I could do it. But I think now the process is a huge part, and then how you interact with it after. Like, what does it do after? Like, I got to a point I'm like, I can build anything. I know that sounds obnoxious, but I had worked for signage companies and I have all these fabrication skills, and that wasn't rewarding, like building the really intricate things. So yeah, I think there's still something about I did it. Like when I grew a gourd like this in a form, I was just like, yeah, I had an
Mhm.
idea and I just did that. So that's really rewarding. But then now I'm like interested with something like gourds or some of my other projects. Like if they go out in the world, what can somebody else do with it?
Mhm. Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
I just think this sort of like artist is genius. Like I think we should be sharing more. And that kind of like goes together with the quilt idea.
Mhm. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like how you sort of tied it together. Well, Andrew, I can't thank you enough for talking with me today. I really appreciate it. It's great learning about your work. I love going through the website. I want to encourage everybody who watched an art show today to go to Andrew's website and check it out and reach out to him and ask him all kinds of questions. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to please like, share, and subscribe Art Show. We really appreciate you watching. It helps push us forward, let other people know about it. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section. We love to hear from you and what you think about Art Show. So again, Andrew, thank you very much. I really appreciate talking with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. And we'll have to talk about milk crates sometime.
There we go. All right. Take care, everyone.